Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm Karli Montague-Cardoso and I'm the Executive Editor of PLOS Mental Health. So today I'm going to try to take you inside the mind of reviewers, or at least what we hope is happening in the mind of reviewers. And a lot of what I share today, it will apply across all publishers and journals, but there will also be some differences. So if you do find yourself in the future submitting a paper to a journal or accepting an invitation to review a paper for a journal, then it's always a good idea to make sure that you're aware of what their expectations and requirements are before you submit or before you carry out your review. So in terms of what will be covered today, I'll briefly explain why I'm running this seminar and what I hope some of you will take away from it. And then, everyone will have a good idea of what the purpose of peer review is, but there may be some outcomes of peer review that are less obvious, so it'll be good to go through those. I'll then move on to briefly explain how editors choose reviewers, which ones they approach, and then I'll go through what it is that reviewers should be assessing when they accept an invitation to review a manuscript. And reviewing is a time investment. It's something that helps to drive progress in the field and also hopefully helps to build your own skills and expertise. So it's a really valuable exercise to take part in. And I'll be sharing some tips that could be useful for reviewers, as well as running through some frequently asked questions before concluding, and then we can open up to any questions or comments that you may have. Please feel free to unmute or write comments in the chat. If you write comments in the chat or questions in the chat, I'll pick those up at the end. So when I put this course together, I wanted to be able to support early career researchers or advocates or anyone who has perhaps a limited experience with peer review who would like the opportunity to start reviewing papers, but wasn't quite sure what would be expected of them or what was involved. And in addition to this, I also wanted to possibly support you when you're writing your own papers, because if you have an idea of what reviewers are looking for, it could determine how you write your own papers. So I'm hopeful that the course content today will be something useful, at least for some of you. So moving on, what is the purpose of peer review? So the first reason for peer review is likely the one that most people think of first, and that is it's there to assess the quality, validity, and originality of the work, and this is done by experts in the field. Editors will usually have very highly relevant expertise to the paper. Not always, sometimes it's more tangential, but even if they have highly relevant expertise, there's always a need for additional independent assessments from people with the specific expertise that are needed to assess the paper. And in this respect, peer review is very much a service to the field as a whole, because it's ensuring that what's made available and informs future research and practices and policies is reliable and it's meeting the field standards. Peer review also provides a service for authors because it offers them an opportunity to improve their study before publication. And as I alluded to just now when I mentioned reliability, it's also there to ensure integrity. It could also lead to collaboration. This doesn't necessarily mean that the reviewer and the authors will work together moving forward, because a lot of the time, most of the time, the authors don't know who the reviewers are. What I mean by this, and what's much more likely, is the fact that reviewers will often suggest changes that the authors will then adopt, and then it improves their work. And as an author myself, many times I've always got a ton of ideas, not just for my current paper, but for future papers from the reviewers. So this, is very much collaboration. And then overall, everyone involved in peer review, the authors, the reviewers, the editors, if taking part with the best intentions, they will find that it's always a learning experience. I, for one, have always, I've learned more about research in the last 5 years being an editor than I did in 15 years in research. Maybe I was doing something wrong as a researcher. Actually, I know one thing I was doing wrong that I'll tell you in a minute. But I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that with editorial work, you're consistently hearing the expert perspectives of such a wide variety of people that you can't not be learning every day. And then in terms of what I was doing wrong in academia, I have to admit I did very little reviewing when I was a researcher. And so I think that really limited my learning experience. Each publisher will have their own peer review model. And you should be familiar with this if you're an author for the journal or a reviewer or an academic editor. There will be a considerable amount of overlap between different publishers because, the good ones will be shaped by the same principles and they'll follow COPE guidelines, but there always are going to be some variations, even if that's subtle. So at PLOS, we have single anonymized peer review. So what this means is the reviewers will know who the authors are, but the authors will not know automatically who the reviewers are. Some publishers will also offer double anonymized peer review. And so this is when the reviewers don't know who the authors are, so their names are left out of the invite email and of the manuscript that they receive. And one of the reasons for this is to avoid any bias. So for instance, there's a concern that perhaps a reviewer might give a high profile author an easier time during review, or maybe a tougher time, could go either way. But regardless, there's a concern that they may treat the author differently. However, at PLOS and any editors that offer single anonymized review, I think it shows an element of trust in the integrity of the reviewer. At PLOS, we also offer the option of signed peer review. So usually the authors will not know who the reviewers are. This is standard. But at PLOS, and indeed other publishers as well, there can be circumstances in which the reviewers are offered the opportunity to sign their review. Please bear in mind, if you're given this opportunity and then the authors choose to publish their peer review history, the readers will also know your identity. They'll know who reviewed the paper and what you've said. We also offer something called portable peer review. So this means if the manuscript has been rejected from a PLOS journal, having already undergone peer review, and then the authors decide to try again at another PLOS journal, then when the paper is transferred, the reviews are also transferred as well. So this gives the new handling editor and the new reviewers some context. As I mentioned before, authors have the option to publish their peer review history. So this means that when readers access the published paper on our journal website, they will also see things like the decision letters, the reviewer identity, if they've chosen to disclose it, and the reviewer reports. So the paper meets all of the ethical and reporting requirements. This is something that PLOS checks. Reaches an editor, and the editor would then like to send it out to review. How do they choose who to invite? So in other words, if you receive an invitation to review a paper, why have you received it? So firstly, they're looking at your expertise. So between you and the other reviewers, they think that you cover all of the aspects of the paper that need to be assessed. At PLOS, at the majority of publishers, this is a minimum of 2 people, but it can be more, especially if the paper is interdisciplinary and has a lot of different aspects. It could be the case that authors have suggested you. So editors will often check for this. Authors may have added it to the tracking system. They may have put it in the author cover letter. And the editors will, of course, check if there's any conflict of interest. And I'll go over what a conflict of interest is shortly. But it could just be the case that the authors really want your opinion. The editors will also usually use any contacts they have, or they'll use tools to search for reviewer candidates. So for instance, PubMed and things like this. I personally really like to use JANE, which is Journal Author Name Estimator, and I'll often recommend this to authors, to editors, to reviewers. It's a really good way not just to find potential reviewers, but also to assess the literature and to find similar papers to the one you're interested in. So if you've not heard of JANE, I would recommend looking it up. And then, of course, sometimes editors will have reviewers in mind because they've used them before, they trust them, they give a good review. This is fine, but they should keep diversity in mind and not do this too often. And when I say diversity, a lot of journals and publishers will say that they keep diversity in mind, but what are they really talking about? Because there's some things that we cannot assume. We don't have all the information about the people on our database. So a lot of what we're looking at is assumed information, and we don't like to assume. So the most frequent factors that we keep in mind when looking at diversity are things that we have on the system. So these are things like location, career stage. Sometimes editors will also look at assumed gender as well, though this is not advisable, but we try to keep in mind as much diversity as we can. So this is why we say try not to go back to the same reviewers all the time. So as I mentioned, reviewers are only invited if they don't have a conflict of interest. And a reviewer with a conflict of interest is someone who works at the same institution, either as any of the authors on the paper or any of the other reviewers. They may be someone who is listed as an opposed reviewer. This is something that authors will sometimes do. They'll communicate this to the editors. How they do this varies between different publishers, and this should always be honoured, but within reason. So for instance, if there's a very specialised field, not many people are working on a particular topic, and the authors have more or less excluded everyone else in the field, then we would need to go back to the authors and ask them to consider cutting down the list. But we wouldn't just go behind their backs and invite anyone on the list anyway. Someone with a conflict of interest is also someone who has collaborated with any of the authors, usually in the last 5 years. This is the kind of the standard cutoff, but there can be exceptions to this. So for instance, there may have been a case in which, you and the authors were co-authors on another paper, say last year, but it was a really large consortium paper. You didn't work directly together. You hadn't collaborated before or since. In that case, we would accept that. That's absolutely fine. Alternatively, it may be that you've not published with the author for, say, 10 years, but you remain close friends. So that would be a conflict of interest. And in that case, we, of course, rely on the transparency of the reviewer. So as a reviewer, you have the right expertise, you don't have a conflict of interest, you've accepted the invite to review a paper. So you're probably then wondering what it is that's already been assessed. Have the editors looked at the paper before they've sent it to you? What have they checked before they've sent it to you? And again, there will be a lot of overlap between different publishers, but there's also variations. One thing to point out, though, is that anything that the editors or the editorial team have already checked, any checks they've already carried out, that doesn't mean you also can't comment on those things. Editors are human, they may have missed something, or they may not have the same expertise as you, so they may be unaware of something. So feel free to comment on any aspect of the paper that you are comfortable doing so. So when the paper reaches the editor and then you, what is it that's been checked? Well, one of the things that's already been checked at PLOS is the data reporting requirements. They need to have been met for the paper to have reached the editor and then reached you. PLOS will also be checking that the research meets the highest ethical standards. They're also checking for the way in which the paper is written. Now, we ask that the paper is written well enough that a reviewer would be able to understand the message and review it. We do not expect the language to be perfect by any means. We know that many authors submitting to us will not be writing in their native language. We do not want this to be a barrier. So all that we ask is that people who are reading the paper can understand it enough that they can assess it. We also check that the paper and the results have not been published elsewhere, and this includes all the results in the paper. So what I mean by this, sometimes the data has already been published elsewhere. You may have maybe like a larger biobank data, or just, a large human study where there's a lot of data that you want to reuse. That's absolutely fine if the authors have carried out, say, a new analysis to gain new insights. And this is a good use of resources. So when I'm referring to results, what I mean is the take-home message of the paper. This is what needs to be original. But if, as a reviewer, you feel that any of these criteria that I've just mentioned have not actually been met when the paper reaches you, then please do feed that back to the editor. So what is it that reviewers should assess? Obviously, they can check for all of the factors that I've just mentioned. And again, this is very journal specific. It's publisher specific and it's journal specific. It varies journal to journal. So for instance, different journals will have a different editorial bar. And it is good as a reviewer to be aware of this, but at the end of the day, it's the job of the editor to assess the reviewer reports in light of the bar. So if you're not too sure about the editorial bar, you can ask or not worry too much, because it's the editor's responsibility. But it's always good to know that some journals will require, for instance, an important conceptual advance, and some may not. And this is something that is usually communicated with you as a reviewer when you accept the invite to review. So for instance, at PLOS, say PLOS 1, PLOS Climate, GPH, Mental Health and Water, they're the journals that actually don't require a big conceptual advance. The work needs to be sound, the work needs to follow the criteria I just spoke about, it needs to not have been published elsewhere, but it doesn't need to be a big novel advance. So firstly, as a reviewer, you're asked to consider if the methods and the analysis that are used meet the field standards, and they're described in enough detail that you could repeat what the authors have done. So if you couldn't repeat what the authors have done, what is it that's missing? Because if there is something missing, the magnitude of what's missing determines whether or not you could recommend a revision or a rejection. We also ask the reviewers to confirm whether or not the conclusions are supported by the data that's presented in the paper. And if not, what would be needed to remedy this? So maybe the authors just need to make some textual changes. That sounds like a revision to me. But if they needed to, say, completely redo the study, then we would lean towards a rejection, because it wouldn't be fair to ask the authors to do it all over again. The other thing that should be assessed is context. So when you're reading the paper, is it clear what the point of the paper is? Does it meet a gap, meet a need? Does it fill a gap? Does it provide something of interest to the community? The fact is, no manuscript is going to reach you in perfect condition. No manuscript that ends up being published is perfect, because there's no such thing. Everything could do with improvement. So the thing to consider is how much work would be needed to get it technically sound, so that the conclusions are suitable, realistic, and useful. And this is also, of course, where the editors would come in, and the amount of revisions that would be considered acceptable really depends on where the editorial bar is, as I mentioned, and the nature of the study. We always, every decision we make as editors in light of the reviewer comments, they have to be ethical, they have to be considerate, and they have to be realistic in terms of what we're asking for. So it is useful for reviewers to have in mind what they recommend, whether it's rejection, whether it's revision, but we do understand that this can be tricky, especially keeping track of the editorial bar. So editors will always evaluate the reviewer decisions holistically and in light of the journal requirements. So at this point, I've mentioned kind of editorial bar, publication criteria. I think it would be useful just to briefly explain what I mean by that. At PLOS, the publication criteria is used to guide the reviewer reports as well as the editor's decision. So as I mentioned, the first thing is that the study must present original research. And depending on the journal, this can include negative or null results. I think that negative and null results are just as important when it comes to health-related studies, because knowing what doesn't work is just as important as knowing what does work. So if you find yourself reviewing a paper where the results are negative or null, just consider whether or not the journal has an editorial bar that would accept that kind of study. PLOS Mental Health would. We also require that the results have not been published elsewhere, as I mentioned. We also require that they're not under consideration at another journal. This is something that obviously we rely on the authors to know about for transparency. We don't know unless it's flagged to us if the authors have submitted a paper to another journal. But if we do find out somehow that the paper is under consideration elsewhere, it will be withdrawn from our tracking system. I should mention though, preprints are absolutely fine. At PLOS, we encourage preprints. We do not consider preprints to be as published. We don't consider them as being something that's under consideration elsewhere. We think they're a really useful record of your study. We also consider replication studies. This is something reviewers often wonder about, but there needs to be a very clear justification for the replication. And again, this is journal specific, so it's always best to check with the editor if you're not sure. And then I think it goes without saying, when you're reviewing a paper, you're checking that the experiments, the statistics, and the other analyses are performed to the highest standard and described in detail, as I mentioned before, because the conclusions really depend on how the data is analysed, so knowing exactly how the authors have treated the data is essential. So as I mentioned, the data must support the conclusions. And as I mentioned, we require that the paper is understood. It's worth pointing out at PLOS, we don't offer copy editing, but we do share a lot of copy editing resources to our authors. And as I've also mentioned, the research, of course, needs to meet all of the ethics and integrity requirements. This is something that's non-negotiable. Anything that appears to deviate from this needs a very clear explanation with original documentation as evidence for the exception. And likewise, reporting standards need to be met in the interest of transparency and open science. So this is to reiterate, this is what I'm referring to when I talk about publication criteria. This is what reviewers should keep in mind. This is what editors will be keeping in mind, and we'll be making sure that all papers tick these boxes. So then if you end up reviewing the paper, you may be thinking, okay, so I've got in my head what I need to be looking for. I kind of know what I'm going to be looking at, but I really don't know how to format this. I'm worried I'm going to miss something. Don't worry about that. There will be guidance to help you, whether it's your first or your 100th review, there's always going to be guidance. The way in which you'll be guided will vary from publisher to publisher, but there is more often than not going to be a form to fill in. And this will trigger you to assess all of the aspects that are required. So don't worry, it's not your responsibility to remember what you need to review. You will be guided on this. So at PLOS, the first thing we do is direct reviewers to resources that will remind you what to do when reviewing a paper, and it will explain what's coming up in the review form, so you can kind of estimate how long you might need, what you're going to have to do. And this is fairly self-explanatory. What I would like to say, however, is that when you look through the review report form, when you look through the resources, if there's anything that's not clear at all, if there's anything that's not been answered, never hesitate to reach out to the editor. You'd be surprised how few authors and reviewers reach out to editors with questions. But they tend to not do that, but honestly, editors are always happy, well, I am, happy to receive questions. So in this case, if you click on the resources, you'll be taken to the PLOS Peer Review Centre, and here you can see a whole variety of guides that you can look through. A lot of it kind of overlaps with what I've been talking about today. So even when you get to the point that you've accepted the invite to review, you'll still be reminded of all of the resources and all of the instructions available. Next, you will be asked to start adding in your comments. And the first comments that come are the comments that the authors will see. And the form will make it very clear which of the comments will be passed on to authors and which of the comments will not be. So keep this in mind if you wish to remain anonymous. There'll be an overall assessment of the technical soundness. You'll then be asked to give an overall assessment of the statistics if they've been used, and you'll be asked to give an overall assessment of the data availability. And these are all like yes, no, not applicable options. So it's fairly well structured. Then you'll be asked basically whether or not you could understand the manuscript. And then from then you can move on to the body of the review. So this is where you provide your detailed comments on the paper, the strengths, the weaknesses, requests for clarification, suggestions for improvement. This is what the authors will specifically respond to in that point-by-point rebuttal. There's no particular way to structure this, but often reviewers tend to go in the order of the paper. You're then asked if you wish to include your identity, as I mentioned before, and you're then given the opportunity to provide confidential information or comments to the editor. So these comments will not end up in the report that authors see. They will not be able to see anything that's marked as confidential to editor. And this is typically a space that you would use if you have serious concerns that you would like the editor to look into. So if you're concerned about the ethics, or you're unsure about a potential conflict of interest that you may have that the editor's not picked up on, that's something I'll talk about in a minute. Anything you'd like to give feedback on, but you would just be more comfortable if the authors didn't see it, you can include that. You also have the option to include any information about anyone who's helped you with the review. That's something I'll talk about shortly. And you can also indicate how interesting you think the paper is if you choose to do so. This is optional. As I mentioned, several of our journals, including PLOS Mental Health, we don't require a significant advance, but obviously a lot of what we publish, or all of what we publish, is still really interesting, and we will promote it or press release papers if there's going to be an interested community. And as a reviewer, you're part of that community. So we really want to hear if you find the paper especially interesting. Finally, at the bottom, you can add in your ORCID ID if you have one, should you wish to receive credit for reviewing activity in this way. And then, so you've reviewed the manuscript, and then the authors go away and they do the revisions. You may then be asked to review the manuscript again. This may be because the revisions were extensive or the requests were quite specialised, so the editor would like you to assess the changes. Or sometimes what can happen, which is a bit more rare, but it does happen, is that a reviewer who has reviewed in the first round drops out, they're unavailable, but the editor still needs an expert to assess the changes. Either way, you'll find yourself reviewing a revision. So what you're assessing here is whether or not the authors have addressed all of your comments in some way, or all of their comments in some way. Even if a suggestion is out of scope, it's not something they're actually going to do, they should still not be completely ignoring the comments. Editors will check for this, they'll make sure that authors have acknowledged all the comments, but it's still something that the reviewers will be checking as well. Another thing to check is whether or not the authors actually did make all the changes that they said they would do in the rebuttal. This, again, is something that editors check, but you may pick up on subtle omissions that the editor's not been able to due to your expertise. And this should be something that the authors guide you with. It should be easy enough to do if the authors have written a good enough rebuttal that clearly references where the changes now appear in the new version of the manuscript. You're also assessing if the responses are reasonable. If the authors didn't do something that was asked, is the reason valid, or are they trying to, say, get away with the bare minimum? Remember, not all journals will expect, say, more fieldwork to be done. Some will accept a tone down of conclusions or an acknowledgement of the limitations instead. So this is something to keep in mind. And finally, we do typically avoid repeated cycles of revision. We try to limit it to 1 or 2 because obviously it's not fair to go back and forth. It's not fair for the authors. It's not fair for the reviewers. If you find yourself seeing a revised paper and you still have some concerns, it's then worth asking yourself, okay, is this coming from a place of preference, or are there still issues that they genuinely need to fix and that are required to ensure that the integrity of the paper is where it should be? If it's the former, if it's a preference, then the editor will just use that judgment. If it's the latter, the editor will ask for the revisions. So when we get to kind of the second round, third round, if we get there, we're really just now asking for changes that are essential for the integrity of the paper. So now we've gone through kind of what you should be looking at as a reviewer. I'd like to go over a few tips that may be useful. These are not the only tips. These are not the only way to do things. Everyone will have their own way, but perhaps some of them are useful for you. Most people say that, well, you do need more than one read through. Many people say that they will read the paper holistically first, just to get an idea of what the take-homes of the paper are. They're not trying to critique it. They're not trying to pick things up or catch things out. They're just understanding what is the paper trying to tell me. It's usually a good idea to take notes, especially if you notice something that you're going to refer back to. And then you will need to read it again, maybe a third time, maybe even a fourth time, often at a section at a time with a different hat on. So now you're not a reader, now you're critiquing it. This is not so much a tip, this is how to do it kind of thing. Always be respectful and constructive and clear. 99.9% of reviewers do this automatically, but I've seen some really rude comments in the past, and I've had to go back to the reviewers and ask them to tone it down. Some editors may paraphrase when the reviews are slightly rude, but this is the best practice because in the interest of transparency, we want the reviewer comments to reach the authors as they are. So if you feel that this is going to be offensive, it's always good to go back to the reviewer. When you are reviewing a paper, it's always really helpful to offer actionable comments and to justify your perspective and be specific. So for instance, rather than saying something like, this is weak, and leaving it at that, it's more helpful to maybe say something like, the strength of the analysis could be improved if authors did X, Y, and Z. That's a much more actionable and constructive comment for authors. And it also helps the editor to assess if something is rescuable. Be honest about conflict of interest. Don't worry if there is something that comes up, say, halfway through the process. Not all conflicts of interest are going to be apparent from public records. So for instance, if you're friends with the author, you just have never published with them, then obviously you would perhaps not accept the review. But maybe you've started to read the paper, you've got halfway through the paper, or you've read the whole paper and you realise, actually, now I've looked at this in more detail, I'm really uncomfortable with this. I don't agree with what the authors are saying. I cannot be neutral. That's absolutely fine. You can withdraw from the review. When it comes to determining if the level of detail is enough, as I mentioned before, a good tip is just to imagine yourself repeating what they did. Have they provided enough detail that you would be comfortable repeating what they've done? And if you can't, what's lacking for you? There's no benchmark in terms of how long it will take. A question I get a lot is, how long is this going to take me? Honestly, I couldn't tell you. It would naturally take you longer if you have less experience, and it will get quicker with time or depending on the paper, but there's really no benchmark to reviewing. So don't put pressure on yourself to do it in a certain amount of time. And one tip that I find quite useful as an author as well as a reviewer is to consider the target readers of the paper. Are the authors setting the scene or explaining the implications effectively? Because this is often where authors will need the most guidance. So as I mentioned before, everyone has their own way of doing this. It's been a while since I was not the editor in peer review. So now what I'm going to do is just share some tips from one of the PLOS Mental Health section editors, Dr. Luke Bearden. He is the section editor of our neurodiversity section, and he's from Sheffield Hallam University. So I'm going to share, he's made a recording. Please somebody interrupt if you cannot hear it. Hopefully you can.
Hi, so my name is Dr. Luke Bearden, and I've been, I've had an academic title for over 20 years. Some might not say I'm particularly academic, but I have the privilege of having an academic title, and I've been doing the job for quite a while. So here are my 3 thoughts, all up for discussion, around what makes a good reviewer, or what to take into consideration as a reviewer. So the first one that I would mention is leave your ego at the door, or leave your ego at the abstract. Leave your ego before you do the review. You're not reviewing against what you think. You're reviewing against a set of clear criteria. And you've got to bear that in mind. So you might read something and you think, oh, I wouldn't do it this way, or I would prefer it to do it that way, or actually you're reviewing against not your own criteria, but somebody else's criteria. They may align to yours, they may not, they may differ ever so slightly, but far too many people position themselves as to say, okay, well, I would have done it this way, therefore your way of doing it is worthy of rejection or needs amending, and that isn't necessarily the case. So my second point would be, read it without reviewing first. If you start reading the piece of work with that set criteria in mind, it's very difficult to digest as a holistic piece of work. So feel free to take your time, kick your feet up, and just read it for academic enjoyment. Then go back, remind yourself of the criteria, and go through it again. And the third one, which should sound really obvious, but I think sometimes people don't recognise this as much as they should, is take this really, really seriously. Give yourself time, space, make sure you've got your intellectual, academic energy at peak, because this is somebody's work that may have taken them a long time. They may have put a huge amount of effort in. So you need to take it with due diligence and give it the attention that it's worth. So those are my 3, not necessarily tips, but ideas for what potentially makes for a positive reviewing experience.
Thank you, Luke, if you can hear me. So yeah, that was Luke's tips. So hopefully some of them were useful for you. And so I'd like to finish off now just by going through some frequently asked questions, and these are based on questions that have come up a lot for me over the years, so I thought it'd be useful to go over them. I'm quite mindful of time, but we're at the last point now. Deadlines. This is one of the most frequent concerns or annoyances when it comes to peer review, understandably. And we as editors often hear, I cannot review this in the time given. It's totally understandable, but please remember that if the paper interests you and you think you'll need an extension, just ask. Editors will usually grant the extension, and if they have ended up receiving all the reports that they need to before you're ready, they'll check in with you and either move the paper along if you've yet to start, or wait for you a little longer. Don't worry about slowing things down. It's up to the editor to manage and juggle the timings and attention to detail. Can I collaborate with someone or send the invite to a colleague? And the answer to that is yes and no. Yes, you can collaborate with someone. As you saw in the reviewer report form, you can name them. You can email the journal and ask if it's okay. And we do often encourage early career researchers to collaborate with their PIs, for instance. But the contents of the invite email is confidential and should never be shared with anyone that is not named in the peer review process. So if you end up getting help from someone, they must be named. We must be aware of everyone that's seen the paper. What if my expertise do not cover the whole paper? This is often the case for interdisciplinary papers. Editors will usually customize the invite to explain what aspect of the manuscript they're asking you to assess. But if they don't, or if you're not sure, you're more than welcome to express your concern before accepting or declining the invitation. Or you can also state in your review which particular aspect you can or can't comment on. Can I ask authors to cite my work? It's very tempting for reviewers, understandably so, but you should only suggest that authors cite particular papers, especially if they're yours, with very good reason. The citation must be the most relevant one. If you ask authors to cite a lot of your papers without a good reason, this will be flagged up, this will be picked up by the editor, and your review may be removed for trying to get citations. In addition, you may want to keep anonymity in mind. If you don't want your identity to be disclosed, remember that reviewers can sometimes give themselves away if they ask the authors to cite their work quite a lot, so just keep this in mind. I'd like to review for a journal. Can I ask to do this rather than wait for an invite? Absolutely. Editors will welcome this. They'll have different ways in which they keep you on record, but they always welcome people who are interested in reviewing. I think I might have a conflict of interest, for instance, because I disagree with the paper. As I said before, if you think you disagree to the extent that you can't fairly assess the paper, simply decline the review. That's absolutely fine. That's what we would recommend you do. If you realise halfway through your report, then it depends on how conflicted you feel. You can withdraw, that's no problem. You can add a confidential comment to the editor so that they can judge. For instance, if you only disagree with a small proportion of the paper, I think it's fine to still review if you disclose that to the editor. If you disagree with the paper as a whole and you can't be neutral, then of course you can withdraw. I'm worried about the ethics or integrity. As I mentioned, always raise this with the editor. We do check for this when a paper is submitted, but of course things slip through the net. Never email the authors yourself. This is something that the editors and the publishers should handle. And then one that comes up quite often, I think I already reviewed this paper at another journal. So again, let the editor know. If you've recently reviewed this paper elsewhere, it could be the case that it was rejected from that journal and the authors chose to submit to this new journal. So if you think that you can then fairly assess the paper again, keep the editorial bar of the new journal in mind. By all means, you're welcome to accept the review. However, if you don't feel you can do that, then please decline. Or it may be the case that the editor researches this and they find out that the paper's already been accepted or is still under review elsewhere, then it would be withdrawn from the system. I suggested rejection, but the editor offered a revision. Was I ignored? And this is sometimes feedback that I have got from reviewers, say if I've offered a revision, but they weren't fans of the paper. No, I didn't ignore them at all. I can see how it would feel that way, but what the editor does is they weigh up all of the comments from all of the reviewers in light of the reviewer expertise and in light of the editorial bar of the journal. So it may be that the reviewer has kind of misunderstood where the editorial bar is. If, however, you feel really strongly that the editor made a mistake and didn't appreciate the gravity of your concerns, then please do give that feedback as soon as possible. And finally, can I see the whole manuscript before deciding whether or not to review it? And the answer to that is no. Only those who are part of the peer review process can see the whole manuscript. You can, however, as I mentioned, withdraw at any point of the process if your circumstances change or you realise you're actually quite uncomfortable down the line. The main thing, though, is regardless of your decision, please communicate that with the editor as soon as possible so that they can find an alternative. So this brings us to the end of this seminar, and as I communicated, I hope that you've taken something useful from it, and you realise that being a reviewer can be rewarding. It can help you develop your writing skills. It can give you ideas for your own project. It could help you to network because you get to know who's doing what. And it ensures that you have a voice in your field as well. And it's one way in which you can shape the work that goes out there. Remember to always be constructive and consider the difference between requirements and preferences, and always reach out to the editor if you need any assistance. I think it's also really useful to remember that the experience of reviewing papers for editors as well as reviewers is a privilege, because you get to see the work before anyone else does, and you can help shape the work. And I think, there is a lot of frustration about the peer review system at the moment at publishers, and that's totally understandable. But I think if people can remember that we are in a really privileged position, that we get to see and shape this work, then I think that can be really helpful. And finally, do not be shy to ask about how you can get credit for reviewing. It's your time and it's your expertise. I mentioned earlier that if you have an ORCID ID, you can add that and you can get credit that way. But if you don't have an ORCID ID, you can always contact the journal and ask for a reference letter that states that you've been providing peer review activity. We have done that and we're happy to do that. So please keep that in mind.